Good evening and welcome to this week's LRB Screen at Home with my wonderful guest, Clio Barnard. Welcome, Clio.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me and having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you here for this special screening and conversation around The Arbour, of course, your crucial film, 10 years old now this year. Many thanks indeed to Michael Charmy and everyone at Artangel for making this screening possible. Also to Verve Pictures and, of course, to the London Review Bookshop and the London Review of Books. This is the latest initiative from both organisations. You have obviously joined us this evening, and welcome indeed to all of you from across the world to be with us this evening, also for previous weeks as well. Of course, all the events that we have hosted as part of this initiative are available to view on the YouTube channel of the London Review Bookshop. So do please find those if you would like to. And do please comment, of course, this evening during the course of the conversation. You can send questions, responses, thoughts directly to Sam, who is monitoring everything going on the YouTube channel, and directly sending questions and comments to me to feed through to Clio at the suitable moment. So many thanks indeed to Sam, to Anthony, who's behind the scenes, making the technical visible aspect of things possible for us. I've got so many tabs open here. It feels like I'm a dealer in acid in the mid 1970s, but I am directly engaged with Sam, Anthony, and of course Clio. Now, Clio, it's a real pleasure to welcome you directly from your shed in Whitstable. Now, we were establishing just before we went live, of course, that you can't see the sea and you can't hear the sea, but you can confirm that the sea is actually there. The Thames Estuary is still present.
The Thames Estuary is still present.
That is great to know, because it's a long time since I've seen that water. We're obviously delighted that you're coming from Whitstable. Whitstable, a great town as part of the North Kent coast. And it's a wonderful synchronicity, because tonight, Sue Jones, the founding director of Whitstable Biennale, which both of us have been engaged with over the years, is celebrating her birthday. So many happy returns of the day to you, Sue Jones, out there on the North Kent coast, bringing culture to us for many years. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. And thank you very much indeed, Clio, for being with us. Now, we're talking about The Arbour, which is an extraordinary and crucial film, both in British and international cinema. It brings together many different traditions of filmmaking, but also a larger cultural portfolio around performance, around documentation, around kind of reenactment in different modes and guises. Now, this was a crucial film for you, of course, a breakthrough film in your own work, but it didn't come from nowhere. It came from earlier traditions and engagements with moving image work that you'd been making over the previous years. Now, thinking back, 10 years back now to when The Arbour appeared, could you have imagined quite the impact it made, obviously internationally, but also how it redirected or confirmed strands of inquiry that you had in your own filmmaking? How is it now, thinking back a decade to when it appeared?
Well, for one thing, it's hard to believe it's a decade. It's hard to believe it's zipped by. But yeah, no, I had no idea that it would kind of have the life that it's had and have the impact that it's had. And yeah, I couldn't have predicted that.
It was a combination of certain forces, of course, the extraordinary collaboration and production with Artangel, which obviously made the project possible. But you'd been working around that idea of partly reenactment, of inhabiting different kind of modes of filmmaking, documentary and performative modes in work, the shorter work that you made just before that. And we're going to look a little bit later at a clip from one of those works. But how did you come across this kind of this way of bringing the sort of performative into film? Because it's not something, of course, that's a given for filmmakers at all. In fact, you're one of the pioneers in British cinema around that. But can you recall for us how that kind of possibility came about?
Well, I guess I trained as a visual artist, so I came to film from that perspective. And I'd made a short film like way back in 1998 where I'd used this technique of actors lip syncing to voices that I'd gathered in interview. So I'd sort of used the technique that's in The Arbour before, but I didn't really know about verbatim theatre at that point. I'd also made this piece that we're going to take a look at later called Road Race, where I'd wanted to record audio at a road race, which is there's 3 traveller underground sports, so bare knuckle fighting, hair coursing, and road racing. And so I wanted to record just the audio and then construct images to that sound, which it didn't quite work out that way. But so, yeah, I've been exploring those ideas, and I've always loved Alan Clark's work. I really love his work. I've got a particular affection for Reed, Sue and Bob too. But I had never read Andrea's plays, and I picked up Reed, Sue and Bob too in a bookshop, and it had been reprinted with the State Fair. So that was sort of the starting point for me of the Arbor. And then simultaneously, Art Angel do a thing called the Art Angel Open, where anybody can put an idea in. And so, yeah, I kind of formulated this idea out of this seed of finding this book, and proposed it to them. So that's how it began.
Tremendous. I mean, we were delighted earlier in the series to show Andrea Lucas-Zimmerman's Here for Life, which was also a project that came out of the Art Angel Open, and has, a kind of sisterhood, I think, with the Arbor in terms of some of its approaches. But the Arbor, when it kind of really sort of exploded onto our screens, drew together Andrea Dunbar's own remarkable life, of course, the sense of the estate she grew up on in Bradford, her own work in theatre and film, and also, of course, interviews with family members and neighbours and so on, into this kind of extraordinary, multifaceted hybrid work that placed itself at the heart of her physical environment, which was about 10 miles, Bradford, of course, from where you grew up in Otley, in Yorkshire. So before you got even to making the Arbor, of course, even thinking about this as a possibility, what was your sense of the city and of your time growing up in terms of Yorkshire and Bradford as a place that you would obviously go to, I'm sure, as you got older?
I think, I loved Alan Clark's work. I love his work for television. But the thing, I guess, about Reed, Sue and Bob too is that I recognise those girls because I guess I'm same generation as Andrea Dunbar, so they were like girls that I went to school with, so so I think that's why I had this particular affection. I mean, a lot of people do. It's a brilliant film. So yeah, I think that's what it was, her really, and that film that drew me back there. And then also because A State Affair, the idea was, which was Matt Stafford Clark's idea, was to revisit that very specific place 10 years on, a decade later, to see what had changed. So I wanted to go back another decade on and see what had changed again, but reflect on those previous representations of that specific place. So I didn't intend to make a film about Andrea or Lorraine. And the initial proposal was actually to do 2 verbatim performances. Bear with me a minute. So two verbatim performances, one on the Arbor, which was where Andrea Dunbar grew up, and one in the House of Lords, because A State Fair had been performed in the House of Lords. So the idea was it would be these two performances, and that you'd intercut between the two. But once I met Andrea's sister Pamela and realised how autobiographical, how verbatim, Andrea's plays were, then it became clear to me and Michael Morris, actually, and the producer Tracy O'Riordan, we kind of all realised at the same time, actually, the sort of, I mean, there's lots of performative elements in the film, but the performance of Andrea's play, The Arbor, on Bradford Arbor, was the thing that would replace the House of Lords, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely does. It's fascinating to hear about that kind of what-if possibility of the House of Lords, which would have taken the work in a very different direction, of course. But I think it's that concentration, as you've said so well, of all those different elements into the Arbor, and the layerings, the sense of the relationships, of course, and also the representations over the years that make the film, so distinctive. And that sense of place is also crucial to you, isn't it? Because we'll come on to it later in the conversation. But Bradford, of course, the city near to where you grew up, has also been the site of The Selfish Giant, and your latest work, Ali and Ava. It's been central, if you like, to how you thought about the work you've made and, of course, your own life.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the other films grew out of making The Arbor. So that sort of, was going to say fixation, but I don't know if that's the right word, but on Bradford really came from like a sort of relay thing almost. So when I was making the Arbor, I met a boy called Matty, and Matty is the boy Arbor in The Selfish Giant is a sort of fictional version of that boy Matty and his best friend Michael.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ali and Ava's came from meeting somebody, an actor who's in the Arbor, who's from Bradford, and somebody that I met through making The Selfish Giant. So it's kind of grown more out of that more than it is about sort of revisiting where I'm from, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
That's give me an affinity with the, you know, I love it there.
Yeah, great. Let's remind ourselves of the strength and the remarkable nature of the Arbor by looking at the trailer now, if we could. Many thanks, Anthony.
When we were kids, we never knew what she was doing, but she used to stay up late and just write and write and write and write.
It was an extraordinary first interview with a writer, because she'd never been out of Yorkshire before, never been in a theatre.
Dear Max, I'm sending you the bit of writing I've done. It's not much really. That's because I've had to take Lorraine out of the nursery.
I think it must have been hard for her to have a mixed race child on a white and very racist estate. If she was alive today, I'd have a lot to say to her.
Thank you very much. That was the trailer, of course, for The Arbor, the film that we're in conversation about with its wonderful filmmaker, Clio Barnard, marking 10 years since The Arbor was released into the world, produced, of course, by Artangel. Many thanks to them for supporting this event. Now, Clio, we've just seen the trailer there, and already, as is expected, of course, from our wonderful audience spread across the world, we're receiving questions about this remarkable film. So let's go straight to several of these now, if we could. Jill has been with us over the weeks. Many thanks, Jill, for your question again this week. And as always, apologies if we don't get to everybody's question. We're extremely grateful for questions, comments, responses, of course, this week and in all weeks of this series. And we do hope we can get to everything, but apologies if we don't, if we run out of time. But I do hope we can. So from Jill, as ever, thank you very much indeed. This is a brilliant experimental documentary, complex on many layers, Jill says. And while filming the scenes on the estate, Clio, how did the audience of local people, most of course of whom are white, reacts to the depiction of the racism that is, of course, prevalent in parts of the community at the time? Now, that's, of course, a very important question for the times that we find ourselves in right now, of course, the nature of this event on this particular day with everything that's going on around us internationally. But how did that, obviously, that important issue kind of find itself played out during the course of the filming?
I think Jimmy Mystery found it really hard, and you know, came to talk to me about that. And yeah, I mean, I often get asked about who are the people who are watching, which I realise it isn't a question, but they're people from the estate. A lot of Andrea's family who were there that night when you know, when that scene, that particular scene, which is where the father's being very racist, is playing out. Yeah, I mean, I guess part of what I think is really brilliant about Andrea in some ways is that she was very uncensored in some ways in the way that she wrote, which meant that it got talked about and it wasn't swept under the carpet and it wasn't denied, that it was spoken about. And, you know, in a way, I mean, I watched the film again this morning, actually, and I think Lorraine's testimony, in a way, is incredibly important, because there's such complexity around race for her, and how difficult it was for her, and how within her own family and within her own community that was so difficult for her.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, please continue.
I was just going to say, in some ways, you know, it's in some ways it's a film about Lorraine rather than a film about Andrea.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we should, of course, say that, you know, while the racism on an estate like that might be, you know, kind of explicit at certain points, you know, we are dealing now with structural racism on a massive level across the whole of our society, where the concealment of that racism, of course, has often been, you know, more damaging and more enduring and more impactful on communities than maybe, you know, that as expressed, you know, in a place like the estate. So it's a complex scenario, isn't it? It will play out, obviously, you know, in the ways that it does for many years to come. But thank you very much indeed for that. And many thanks, Jill, for your question. Now we'll move on to Barry from New Zealand. Barry, great that you're...
Add something. I'm really sorry.
Of course.
Add something.
No, please do.
If there is racism there, it reflects racism elsewhere.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. No, you're completely right, of course. Thank you very much indeed for that question, Jill, and obviously Clive for your response. Now, Barry from New Zealand, many thanks for being with us, Barry. I'll just read your wonderful statement out and end with the question. The Arbor is a remarkable film, a work of art. To capture the tragedy of a life and reveal the achievements of that life in a single film is a feat in itself. But Barry, you felt the film did more than that. The tragedy here is not the tragic wisdom that Nietzsche saw in Greek tragedy. It's the tragedy of our times, with all the various attendant abuses, addictions, physical abuse, of course, especially towards women, racism, as we mentioned, and poverty. That Andrea Dunbar managed to produce her work and express her own genius in the midst of all this is remarkable. But finally, of course, she didn't escape the horrors that surrounded her, and she died very young. It's brutal and emotional stuff. But I wonder if Clio found that emotion, that raw emotion expressed in the life and that finally impacted on the life, difficult to deal with in the making of the film. How did you find that relationship with such emotional and, you know, traumatic material, of course, you know, in the process of the making? How do you find your way through that in your filmmaking practice?
Yeah, but it was very difficult, and yeah, huge emotional impact. But you know, it didn't happen to me. So yeah. I think you have to, you know, I have to kind of go away and deal with it on my own, yeah. And come back and be there for the people that I'm asking to tell me their story and make their story public. You know, so it's a massive responsibility, and that you know, and that gave me, you know, sleepless nights, and I think it should. I think that's the way it ought to be, in a way.
You know, I mean, the responsibility is, as you say, is absolutely crucial, but you have this extraordinary facility and ability with your performers, and of course with the lives behind those performances, in terms of that intimacy and that making of a kind of community on set. You know, how does that relationship develop? When does it start in relationship to the filming? Because of course it has to start much earlier to engage with people in that situation, to build that trust. I mean, you obviously have that incredible ability with it, but what is the sense of the process that leads up to the filming? Can you give us an idea of that?
Well, because I just recorded audio, I went up there by myself with a microphone and a Zoom. Not a, you know, like a little recording device, audio recording device, and it was just me for 2 years, going and sitting with people in their kitchens and in their kitchens mainly, and talking to people. So I got to know people very well, and over time and slowly, and I think it was like 90 hours or something like that of audio recording. Which I then worked with an editor, Daniel Goddard, and we edited that down. And then it was only then that we went up to Bradford with a crew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to the further questions now. They're coming in. Thank you very much indeed for that. So now, following on, Catherine Putman. Many thanks, Catherine, for being with us. Now, you asked for the filming of the play that's filmed within the film on the estate. Some of the onlookers are nodding to each other or gesturing that what they're witnessing appears to be very accurate, as if to say, yes, that's how it was or still is. Were you aware of this process going on behind you, as it were, during the filming, or was it a kind of happy accident, as she says? I mean, Catherine asks this because she loves the fact that Andrea Dunbar's her own legacy is that you write what is said, you don't lie, and she feels that your own film does that. So that kind of ripple effect out from the filming, were you aware of that as that was unfolding?
Yes, because those people are Andrea's family. So Pamela still lives on the Arbor, and that's, you know, so the actress, Catherine Pogson, who plays Pamela, are standing next to each other in that doorway with Kathy, her sister, and her, you know, and actually her nephew, Richard Dunbar, plays one of the boys on the wall who fights a guy who's actually playing his father, David. So kind of everybody, because I'd spent so much time there and so much time on the Arbor getting to know people. So the mum of the boy who the boy in The Selfish Giant is based on is sitting on the wall at one point. So yes, I was very aware of that. And they'd never, you know, a lot of people that hadn't seen the play before. So, and yes, and Pamela said how accurate that night was when her brother Speedy had died and Yusuf and Andrea moved out. But the inaccuracy was that Pamela was there, but she's not represented in the play, you know, because as we know, you shape things, you know, and which in a way is the point of the lip syncing and is the point of making the direct address in Andrea's play.
No, exactly. I mean, you're taking raw material. I mean, raw in every sense of the word, you know, and obviously the shaping is what gives it that force, that rigor, and then translates to the audience, of course, in such powerful ways, as we know across the years how impactful the film has been on many people who, you know, have no direct experience of such communities or landscapes, you know, and yes, of course, are moved by the deep human story that runs throughout it. Thank you very much indeed, Claire, and thank you again for the question. Let's move on to Jonathan now. Jonathan actually comes from Cross Hills, very near Keighley, so he's very local in the scheme of things to the film's experience. And he asks, however harrowing the content, he always looks for signs of hope in a narrative, and hope is all we have, really, particularly, of course, at such a time, you know, when we're facing so many challenges. But he asks you, Clive, where is the hope in the Arbor? Is there hope in the Arbor? And I think that could of course apply to the estate, but also, of course, to the film. The film itself is a form of hope, that it can carry such experience forward to the rest of us. But how do you think of hope in relation to the work you make?
Well, there's sort of two parts of my answer in a way, and one is about trying to craft an ending that had a seed of hope in it, but wasn't false hope. So I think there's nothing worse than false hope, because you smell it a mile off, and then it therefore has the opposite effect of what you want. But you know, Lorraine comes out of prison and she's clean, and you know, she is still clean 10 years on, a decade on. So I think there's hope there. I think, and the legacy of Andrea's work makes me hopeful, because if it wasn't for Andrea, the film we wouldn't be able to look across 3 generations of one place, or 3 decades of that one place. We wouldn't be able to do that sort of slice through time to look at, you know, socioeconomic deprivation in one very specific place. So yeah, that I guess those things make me hopeful, and it makes me hopeful that people engage with, that they care about Harris's death, that they care about Andrea's death, that they care about what happened to Lorraine. I think that's really important.
It absolutely is. Thank you very, very much indeed. Right, well, we've got some more questions that will follow on from that, I think. But let's have a look now, if we could, at the clip from the work that you mentioned a little bit earlier. This is Road Race. Now, originally, this is a 2-screen installation, so we have a sense of that in the clip we're about to show. One screen is is kind of immersed within the larger one. But could you just again just set this up for us? It's a clip of the motorway race, but this comes from a larger work, and it's a very distinctive one, working in this case with the Roma community, the Gypsy community in Kent, I believe. In
Kent, yeah. So as I said earlier, there's sort of 3 underground traveller sports: bare knuckle fighting, hare coursing, and road racing. And I was really fascinated by the road racing as a sort of act of kind of anarchic act of momentary visibility, of kind of reclaiming the road. And so, yeah, I wanted to make something that was about that. And my initial idea, like I said, was to go and record audio and then construct images around that audio. But actually, when I got there, people were very wary and didn't want to wear the audio equipment. A guy jumped in my car and asked me to drive him in the race, which I kind of thought, I don't think I'm going to be able to, like the race is crazy. So I said, no, you drive. Which meant that I could film him. So I filmed this little bit of footage and then kind of reconstructed that footage, it kind of in the language of cinema, really to ask questions about that language. That was my intention.
Tremendous. Let's have a look at that now, please. Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, 500 quid. Do you want to bet, James?
Who'd you fancy?
I'll have Levi.
No, 500 quid on the other way.
Do you reckon he'll sell him?
I don't think so.
He's the best in the country though, isn't he?
Yeah, it's 27,000.
This ain't a bit of the race.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a clip from the 2-channel installation Road Race, which is one of Clio's earlier works. I'm in conversation with Clio Barnard, the maker, of course, of The Arbor, which is the film we're talking about here on LRB Screen at Home, a film 10 years old. Delighted to have Clio and you, of course, the audience with us. Now, Clio, we've been having some questions coming through already from the audience. Many thanks indeed for those. Now, I'd love to see Road Race restage. That's something for another time, perhaps, certainly when we can all meet in person together and actually go to a gallery and see a film properly installed. This is a 2-screen film. But let's come back now to The Arbor, of course, a single screen work, which has had a huge international impact. We just had a question before the clip from Jonathan near Keighley. Now we've got a question from Sarah coming through the YouTube comments option. Many thanks, Sarah. Not sure where you are in the world, but thank you for joining us. Now you've raised the question, the movie and the mechanisms of making it were fascinating. Has this been used before and since, to your knowledge? Now, Clio, of course, this is something that you've used discreetly and particularly strongly. Of course, you established it arguably in The Arbor. But are you aware of kind of having a sort of knock-on influence in larger cinema that you're aware of, that this mode has been sort of particularly borrowed?
There's a film that I'm completely blanking the name of, which is a really wonderful film about a guy who's going blind. And he recorded, he recorded audio of that as he was.
That's right, isn't it? And it's about John Hull, the writer, and it's called. So somebody will hopefully tell us that, because I can't go online now.
It's it's a really, really wonderful film, and I really urge you to see it. And
That's a good call. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's think about that one, shall we? Yeah, absolutely.
sorry, I can't remember the name.
No, we'll come. We'll definitely come to that.
Blindness, that's it. Thank you. Notes on blindness. Yeah.
Notes on blindness. Yeah.
Mm.
So do please see that. That's true, isn't it? Thank you very much indeed for that. And now we're going to a question now, which I think in a way you've hinted at, because of course the longevity of your relationships with the people in your films is what's significant. Of course, before, during, very carefully handling relationships during the making of the film and afterwards. Now, Sim Panassa has come in with a question. Many thanks indeed to you for that. How did you navigate the ethics and care of the family during the process? Now, we perhaps have touched on that a little bit, but what is your relationship in an ongoing way with people? Because these are such intense relationships built around such difficult and powerful material. How do you navigate those relationships afterwards?
Well, I'm still in touch with Lorraine. I'm still in touch with Anne and Steve, and Pamela. So yeah, I keep in touch with people. Sadly, Lisa died, so a couple of years ago.
Thank you very much. Now this follows on in a little bit in a way. With Lorraine Samaya, with regards to her own difficulties, especially with regards to Harry's, is the kind of navigation of these. I'm not looking for personal stories here as such, but this is a question that's come into us in terms of how you frame that as something that can be carried into a creative space. I mean, it's not about asking for sort of personal details here of that particular scenario, but could you give us a sense of your method, if you like? I mean, I don't want again to depersonalize it, so it's very sensitive material, all of this. But in terms of translating, shall we say, carrying across such intimate and often difficult experiences into this creative space, how does that actually occur on the ground, shall we say?
Do you mean in terms of the process of making it from?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Arbor is a particularly, obviously intense example, but in all your work, there are very strong personal stories, personal experiences that you have to shape and reshape, as you mentioned earlier, into a creative work that can be read and experienced by other people. So, is there a kind of pattern emerging now across your many years of filmmaking about how you approach this?
Well, I think in the Arbor, the difficult thing was about what was left out. And in terms of managing that, in a way, because Lorraine's so central to it, I guess I was in constant conversation and consultation with her about that. And also then there were certain things in terms of shaping the story that you need that aren't to explain to an audience. So then there might be certain things I'd need to go back to her and say, could you just tell me about that in a slightly different way or something like that.
Yeah.
I particularly needed to do that with Matt Stafford Clark, I remember, so that you understood how the A State Affair related to Andrea's work.
Yeah.
So because that was quite a complicated thing to explain.
Yeah.
It was tricky with Lisa because in some ways, in the end, the film begins with both of them talking about their very different experience of Andrea and very different experience of this one same moment that they both remember. But really then the second half of the film is much more about Lorraine. So I think that was hard for Lisa. But of course, Lisa's voice in there is absolutely essential in order for us to understand in a way the subjectivity of of retelling, of memory of telling your story. It changes every time.
Exactly. No, it does. And we'll come on to obviously your later films and perhaps those relationships in those contexts, very shortly. But just before we come to those, a nice couple of questions about previous screenings, actually, interestingly, of the Arbor that our viewers have attended. Adam Huffman, many thanks for being with us again, Adam. Remembers a screening with you at the Corner House in Manchester when it was still so named 10 years ago, when someone said all social workers should watch this, but others have said this is patronizing. Who do you think is the audience for the Arbor? I mean, that's on one level, of course, a hopeless question. It's not Adam's, it's mine. But everybody should be an audience for the Arbor, but are there people you're particularly thinking about when you make a film, and who you ideally would like to see it?
It's hard not to say everyone, but it's also, you know, realistically, being realistic about who would go and see what. I mean, I don't necessarily call it this, but I've seen it called an avant-garde documentary. You know, that's quite niche. So, you know, but I guess also I wanted it to speak to an audience who might think about questions of representation, and I also wanted it to engage people emotionally. So I didn't want those formal techniques that I was using to push an audience away. So I wanted it to, you know, an audience to be able to engage with it. And you know, I know Lorraine has used the film in her own kind of you know, treatment since, and Anne and Steve became foster parents, you know, and I know that there was a bit of worry about that, because about the social services and what they would feel about their criticisms of it. But it was embraced actually by the people that Anne and Steve spoke to. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we've got another question responding to an earlier screening. This is from KJ. Many thanks indeed for this, KJ. You saw this in Amsterdam at the documentary festival there, and you were troubled by the audience often laughing, you know, throughout the film at different points. And the question really for you, Claire, is do you think that's an effect of the displacement of the technique, or maybe it's a cultural disconnect outside of UK experience? There's two kind of displacements at work there. Do you have a sense of why that might be, and does it matter in a larger sense, perhaps?
Well, I mean, obviously I wasn't there, so I don't know what they were laughing at. But yeah. I mean, I think Andrea's play is very funny. You know, I think the scene with the girl on the bus is really funny. I think the girl when she gets arrested by the policeman and she doesn't want to tell him where she lives, I think that's very funny. So I hope that's what they were laughing at. But
yeah, we'll never quite know, but I suppose those issues of something being very culturally specific, at least in its origination, if not in its humanity underneath, which of course is much wider. I was curious, you know, thinking about this event today, looking a little bit at earlier reviews of the film. Film Comment called it a bewildering documentary. You mentioned the avant-garde documentary aspect of it. Bewildering, I think, is a slightly strange word to use for this film. It seems to be very, very much grounded in the diverse realities of its participants. But I guess that's how film works, isn't it? It moves beyond borders and finds a different response wherever it might do. Let's look now, if we could, at your next film, the follow-up film, in some ways, The Selfish Giant. You've already mentioned a little bit about that, but I wonder if you could just set up the trailer for The Selfish Giant for us, because, as you say, the name, the Arbor, becomes the name of a key protagonist in the film. So there's a direct link and a locational link in Bradford with this film.
Yeah, the direct link really is that the first person that I met who lived on the Arbor was a boy called Matty, and that's who the character in The Selfish Giant, the protagonist, is based on, and him and his friend Michael. So yeah, I guess this came from the seed of this idea really was actually when I was going with Tracy up to Buttershaw to show them a cut of the Arbor. And I said, you know, I've got this idea that I want to tell this story of Oscar Wilde's Selfish Giant, but I want to set it here. So, yeah.
A great story, Oscar Wilde, rest in peace. So what a giant cultural figure. Let's have a look at the trailer now, please, for The Selfish Giant. Thank you.
Watch it.
You've been excluded permanently.
Sick? He's coming out.
He's at school. He's better off there than hanging around here with you.
What are you doing, Saeed? Let's get out and make some money, Con.
What's that? Where'd you get that?
It's cable. We found it.
Take it inside.
There you go. 110 quid there.
Vandalism, trespass on the railway.
Shh.
There's some unscrupulous people out there getting kids to do their dirty work. Don't want you going down there no more.
Reckon we could get that cable off at pylon? Probably about 500 quid.
Don't even think about it, Harbour. It's too risky.
Come on, man, I can't do it on my own.
You're a kid. I want better for you.
You didn't this, did you? Gonna get your head kicked in.
Don't stand up for yourself. You're soft.
Harbour, it's me. Chill out.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was the trailer for The Selfish Giant. And just to remind you, of course, that if you haven't seen the others of Clio's films, you can find them in all the usual ways, of course, on all the various platforms. And please do so if you haven't, because we're celebrating the Arbor tonight, of course, a 10th anniversary screening. Many thanks indeed to Clio for being with us and to Archangel for enabling this screening and the event in conversation. But do please find, of course, both The Selfish Giant, Dark River, Clio's following film, which we'll come to shortly, and of course her new film, which will come out next year, which we'll come to at the end of this conversation. So many thanks for being with us, Clio. Now, we've been talking about the Arbor, of course, very particularly in the incredible sort of methodology, the approach that you formulated in that, and that intimacy of encounter with your performers, non-professionals, actors often inhabiting aspects of their own life, continues in a slightly different register, of course, with The Selfish Giant. But as Peter Bradshaw in his Guardian review in the trailer we just saw said, absolutely heart-wrenching in its impact on the audience. So you mentioned before we saw the clip, before we saw the trailer, of how you'd met Matty, whose life and character comes into the Arbor. But then, in terms of shaping this Oscar Wilde short story into a radically different setting, how did that idea then translate into the narrative that we see carried forward in The Selfish Giant?
Well, originally I was going to, in the Oscar Wilde fairy story, it's told kind of from the giant's point of view, and I did a version of the script which was like that, and then realised I was much more interested in the boys and their friendship and how their encounter with the scrap dealer, who's the person who I see as the giant, changed their relationship. Yeah.
In terms of how you write a script, and then of course it's embodied on screen and incarnated by the performers, is there room to maneuver between the written script, of course, apart from the actual lines of dialogue sort of being taken on by the performer, but is there an improvisational aspect to how it then meets the rehearsal and screening and shooting process?
Yes. So I wrote the script and everything was actually quite tightly scripted, but then I love to open it up so that there's bits where Connor and Sean are kind of doing their own thing, and I guess we got into the swing of it after a while, where they knew to do that, and then I'd see them do something that I loved, and then we'd riff with it. They'd riff with it.
Exactly. Now, the people, obviously, referring to your films, are talking about a kind of heightened realism, a kind of lyrical take on the real, in the spirit of filmmakers like Ken Loach and so on. But you've spoken elsewhere about how that's actually not really what you are trying to do, or even where you would situate yourself in filmmaking terms around a naturalism or a realism. There's something else going on for you, of course, and with The Selfish Giant, explicitly a kind of fairy tale from Oscar Wilde's original text. Where do you sort of situate yourself in terms of how you think about what film cinema can do and what you're doing with it?
Well, in a way, with the Arbor, I was sort of questioning what that idea of authenticity, and a film that I really love and has had a massive influence on me is Chronicle of a Summer, the Jean Rouge film. Yeah. Who says as soon as the camera is involved, it changes everything. It's a catalyst. Whereas direct cinema likes to pretend that the camera's not there. So in a way, and that's kind of the aesthetic of social realism. It is, in some ways, it's like the aesthetic of direct cinema. So it's like becomes a shorthand for authenticity. And in some ways, I don't really believe in that. So part of what interested me with The Selfish Giant was that you're telling a fairy story or a myth, but you're rooting it in the real. So you don't deny that you're constructing it and shaping it and metaphor and creating tragedy in this case. You own that, and that's don't hide it, I suppose.
But I think, the great skill of your filmmaking, across the different works that we're talking about, is this ability to hold these different registers in place, to have us thinking about what film can do, how stories are told, levels and tiers of representation, and at the same time, of course, to take us, by the guts emotionally, in the most humane and engaged ways, and to, wrench us towards an awareness, not with any degree of hostility involved at all, of an understanding of these difficult lives. I think it's a really extraordinary, achievement on your part, and we'll come to, your most recent film a little bit at the end. But if someone is looking at your work and they're seeing these big and important issues around class and economy and labour, work and the lack of work, forms of community, marginalisation and so on, if that was looked at on the page, one would feel, of course, this is, necessary work, but it perhaps is very dry. And the opposite, of course, is at play. You are living, inhabiting these lives for us and communicating to them to us with such immediacy and vigour. How do you kind of prepare your crew and your fellow travelers behind the camera for the kind of work you're making? You obviously are working with people repeatedly. Some of the key members of your team, of course, are people you've worked with in an ongoing way. But is there a sense of how you prepare the team for this filmmaking immersion?
Well, in a way, with The Selfish Giant, it was, both The Arbor and The Selfish Giant felt new to me, because The Arbor was this very specific thing that was, I guess I'd used that technique before, so it was less weird to me than it was to other people.
Yeah.
Back to lip syncing, and then The Selfish Giant was it's more conventional, I suppose, in terms of the kind of film it is and the way it's made. But that was new to me at that time, because I'd never made a kind of straight narrative film. I'd never written a narrative screenplay before. I had written a short, actually, but I'd never, so it felt quite new to me. And I know that's not quite answering your question, but it was, in a way, what we had to do with The Selfish Giant was shape the way we worked around the two leads who'd never acted before. So everything was about holding them. So that's what the other cast members had to do, and that's what we had to do as a crew. And Mike Healy, who's the cinematographer, is really wonderful at doing that, and very instinctive and intuitive and sensitive to what the boys needed from us, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was a great moment, actually, when Mike came and whispered to me, could you tell the boys not to move when I find them? Because he'd kind of moved through the scene, the shot of them, and they felt that they were in the way, so they'd move. It's like,
I see.
you.
That's a very nice idea. Thank you. That's tremendous. So we're moving into some the kind of towards the close now. Some final questions about the Arbor before we talk about your more recent work and your work to come. But an interesting thought here from Sim, who raised a question earlier. Clio, have you ever staged, produced a play, and would you be interested to do so if you haven't, given obviously your interests on screen?
I haven't, and I mean, like I said, I'm sort of visual arts background, not theatre background, and I was really nervous about directing The Arbor on The Arbor, because I'd never directed it before. But actually, I really loved doing it, and yeah, I mean, maybe I would. And also, sometimes I think a theatre version of The Arbor could be kind of fascinating, although obviously the way things are at the moment, that's not. Very likely.
Not in the near future, no, for sure. And we're very aware, of course, that this conversation is going out against a backdrop of cultural announcements today about the threat to theatres, to music, to cinemas, and so on a huge scale. So how that plays out in the near and mid-term is obviously anyone's guess. If you find me looking into the middle distance, it's only because I'm contemplating my own future in that regard, of course, and I will absolutely return to the present immediately, should I do that. We have some more questions and comments. Many thanks indeed for all that you've sent in. An interesting thought here about your Yorkshire identity in a way, Clio, from Vicky Allington. Is Clio a fan of David Peace or Gordon Burns' work at all? This interest in fame in Yorkshire and those arguably forgotten strikes all sorts of notes for her with their work in terms of how yours sits alongside theirs in a different medium, of course. This idea of, I guess we're thinking now about north-south divides, we're thinking about a post-industrial landscape and wealth very much concentrated in London and the south. So writers in those voices have kind of brought that to their readers' attention. Do you think about yourself in a kind of regional sense as a maker of the regions and the attendant concerns?
Not really. That's my very short answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think for me it's so much more about Alan Clark and that very specific film, Reese and Bob too. It's not really about those writers. I mean, I admire what they do, but I personally don't see that relationship. But it's always interesting to me when other people do.
Yeah.
Curious to know why, but yeah.
Exactly. No, it's interesting. I mean, obviously the power of Alan Clark's film and then Andrea's work, both in that, of course, and across her whole oeuvre, has been so influential and striking to people. And now, of course, the Arbor carries that legacy forward. I was interested to read recently that Adele Stripe, the Yorkshire novelist, has written a novel about Andrea's life, and that has had a staging as well before the current situation we find ourselves in. So there's a kind of ripple effect that is so important in keeping these voices and their work alive. So that's part of the landscape, I guess, which is how it's great that things can work while they are still supported. It's
a very brilliant book that I'd really recommend everybody.
Please do find that. Adele Stripe, a wonderful novelist based in Mytholmroyd in Yorkshire. So please do find her work if you can. Another question now, a kind of thought about the family in the Arbor. From Saina, I hope I get your pronunciation right. Very struck by the loyalty, the unflinching loyalty between certain members of the family in the Arbor. And what is your sense of how people find forms of cohesion and kind of onward ability to cope in difficult circumstances? Because, of course, that's something that we've been very struck by in the current crisis that we've been facing, of course, globally and also nationally, how people find forms of community and mutual aid and support and care for each other. But obviously in many estates across the country which have been deprived for much longer, people are required to do that, of course, just to keep going, aren't they? They don't have to have a kind of external crisis that we've all sharing to do that. They have to find ways to support each other. And I guess you came across that directly.
Yeah, and increasingly so. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's something about looking back over a decade, if things were bad then, they're 10 years of austerity.
Exactly.
Worse now. So, yeah.
No, I mean, we find ourselves in obviously, very difficult times, not least on the back of austerity, and now with, all sorts of cuts imposed and otherwise coming to us because of the collapses that we've experienced, and again, an international situation for us. So I wonder now, thinking as we move towards the close, thinking about the Arbor, of course, but also using it as a bridge to your recent work with Dark River, a film that we haven't talked about so much at all now, but maybe we encourage people to see that. It sits both alongside and also absolutely carries on your inquiry into parts of the country, places, regions, in this case, the wider Yorkshire landscape. And again, how lives find ways to endure through difficult experience. But thinking now about what that kind of filmmaking means at the time that we're in, because it shows a form of community, it shows a way of working intimately with people close up, not removed, not virtually or on Zoom or anything like that. So what are your thoughts now about filmmaking and how things might or might not be possible in the coming period, certainly as we have a sense that they will be difficult culturally and obviously for everyone.
Well, I think probably telling stories becomes more urgent than ever. And I think, you know, I was going to say an innovative species, but in that I think we'll find ways to tell those stories, and they may not be the same way that we've been able to tell them before. But you know but we will. So, you know, I don't know. There's so much uncertainty. It's very hard to answer the question, of course, but yeah.
No, it really is. I mean, I was just looking at some of the news coming in, you know, before we went on air, and Oliver Dowden, the Culture Minister, welcoming the Premier League, which of course is another kind of entertainment. And at the same time, The Great Gatsby is proposing to do its immersive theatre staging in full PPE gear, building that into the narrative of the Scott Fitzgerald story. Slightly hard to imagine that. While Grease is playing in a Belfast shipyard in drive-in cinema terms. So I guess people are responding however they can to the current situation and trying to find a way forward. But film is a particular medium that both, of course, can carry digitally and remotely, as we've experienced, of course, over the last months, as this itself is carrying, while at the same time the making of film coming together very close to and making an intimate space, as you've done over your extraordinary work, is obviously much harder to do in the current situation. So we'll see where we go. But let's, before we close, just talk a little bit, if we could, as much as you are able to, about Ali and Ava, your new film, which again is set in Bradford and does have some links back, doesn't it, to your earlier work in terms of how the kind of narrative has developed.
Yeah, so the characters of Ali and Ava are inspired by people that I've met while I was making The Arbor and The Selfish Giant. So it's thus kind of taken me back to Bradford. And Sean Thomas, who's in The Selfish Giant, is in Ali and Ava, and Natalie Gavin, who is in The Arbor, is in it too. So it kind of yeah, it feels like it's picking up the baton in a way from the previous films.
And you were lucky to film that. You completed filming before the virus and before lockdown, and we should be hoping to see that in whatever form the world allows during 2021, I hope. Is that right? Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
Tremendous.
Yeah, we were very lucky that we managed to get it shot.
Well, I've been very aware that we've been incredibly privileged, obviously, not only to be in conversation with you, but also to have a glimpse, albeit in slightly fuzzy terms, at your wall. I mean, I would love to go to the wall with you now, not, of course, in an economic meltdown sense, but actually creatively. Behind you on the wall is your current project. I don't want to in any way force you to engage and betray confidentialities on that. But you are operating, obviously, from your shed. This is your creative space, and you have a number of projects on the go. And so are you working remotely now with other members of the team in terms of Ali and Ava?
Yeah, we did a lot of the sound work remotely. So I've got some big windows here. So I blacked out all my windows. I had a monitor so that I could try and look at the grade. I got myself a good, decent pair of headphones, and we did additional dialogue recording. That was fun, with lots of actors in their wardrobes and on via Zoom and various different methods, to try and kind of keep the post-production process going, which,
tremendous.
So
Well, very glad that you could do that, and we absolutely look forward to Ali and Ava as we move to a close. Just to remind you, of course, that Clio's feature film work is available on all the usual platforms. Please do find her other films if you haven't seen them. This is the LRB Screen at Home initiative. It's comes to you thanks to, of course, the London Review of Books and the London Review Bookshop. Please do support them in all the ways that you know how to at this crucial moment of transition as we come out of lockdown. Keep an eye on the London Review Bookshop pages and various social media outlets for news, of course, of reopening in the weeks to come, we hope, and all the full details of their incredible stock in store and online available for you to purchase. I would draw your attention, of course, at this point to particular offers as part of this initiative, both the subscription offer, which you will find details of if you go to lrb.me/screen, an incredible subscription offer there for you. And of course, don't forget the LRB book box, carefully selected titles for your reading pleasure wherever you might find yourself. Many thanks to all of you for viewing this event and being with us on the film journey over the last weeks, wherever you might come from. Many thanks to Andre from Buenos Aires. I hope we've answered your question, as well as Soma from the Welsh Borders. I hope we've dealt with that as well. Thank you very much indeed for those. Next week, we're delighted to be in conversation with the wonderful Canadian poet and novelist, the author of the award-winning Fugitive Pieces, Anne Michaels, and we will be shortly leaving you with the trailer for the film that she will be responding to, the great film about film itself, Dawson City, Frozen Time. I do hope you can join us for that next week. But before that, many thanks indeed for being with us, Clio. It's been a real pleasure being in conversation with you. Many thanks to Anthony, to Sam, to everyone at the LRB and the London Review Bookshop for making this all possible. And now I'm delighted to leave you with the trailer for Bill Morrison's extraordinary film, Dawson City, Frozen Time. Thank you very much for being with us.
This is fascinating. These are World Series shots from 1917 and 1919. In Canada, just getting a hold of these videos is fascinating, huh?
It was an incredible story.